What it do, cucks? It's your boy the Hater, and it's time for another episode of Hater on the Road. That's right. Today's video is going to be WWE Sucks Part 4, focusing specifically on factions, okay? And now, the Hater is going to give you a nice, good rant and some good points about why WWE sucks by focusing on one of the cornerstones of wrestling, factions. And I'm going to do it like that because that's how I roll, all right? Now, factions have always been, in my personal opinion, one of the most important and most entertaining parts of wrestling, right? A faction can make or break a show. Now, the question becomes, what makes a good faction? Number one, in my opinion, is the overall category and the overall element of faction cohesiveness. This manifests in a number of ways. Number one, the faction has to have a delineated goal, right? I guess these are the real reasons. A delineated goal, right? It all goes under cohesiveness. So what I mean by that is the faction has to have a reason for existing beyond we're a faction, right? Now, I know that sounds cheap, but it's true. You look at certain factions, like, for example, Retribution or The Vision, factions like the Seth Rollins faction with Buddy Murphy and AOP. You look at factions like the Wyatt family, and they have no certifiable reason, as to why they exist. Meaning, they have no goal. The goal cannot simply be, we are here to become dominant. That is presupposed in the existence of every faction, right? No faction exists aside from wanting dominance. But why do you want the dominance? For example, The Undertaker, player, when he started the Ministry of Darkness, the faction had a clear goal. The goal was to bring evil and chaos to the WWE, right? They were basically devil worshippers. Farouk and Bradshaw were called the acolytes. The Undertaker represents the literal devil. He wants power because he wants things to be evil. The presumption is that he then wants to influence WWE to bend to his will. In other words, the faction of the Ministry of Darkness has no interest in world titles, beyond the fact that world titles will give them the power to do what they please, right? Meaning that if The Undertaker were to win the world title as part of the Ministry of Darkness, he shouldn't be celebrating at all, right? He should be celebrating in the context of, my evil is now going to take over because the WWE is forced to present me, right? Because I'm the champion, and therefore I have more leverage. But he should not be proud on an individual level, right? The Undertaker shouldn't be like, I finally did it. Who cares if he did it? His goal isn't to be champion or to make money. It's to spread evil. So, with that being said, if that cannot be explained in a faction, if the motivation cannot be explained, then in my opinion, a faction has no interest and no reason to go after world titles. But nowadays, for example, the Wyatt family, the Wyatt Six, whatever the fuck they're called, right? They're the tag team champions in SmackDown, right? Why? Why do they care about being SmackDown tag team champions? As I understood it, when they were introduced, they were basically like the Ministry of Darkness. They want to hurt people. They want to cause chaos. How do you cause chaos? By being a regular tag team that defends the titles against other regular tag teams. Now, another thing that the faction needs, in my personal opinion, is some sort of cohesion in terms of their movesets, their presentation, their theme song, and their dress code, right? It doesn't make sense if a faction has people that are all different. For example, the Bloodline. Roman Reigns is just a regular guy, right? The Usos are just regular guys, and Solo is just a regular guy. And Paul Heyman is just the manager, right? They dress wearing t-shirts, and eventually they started wearing the Ula Fala once in a while, right? That's not sufficient. A great example of a faction that was sufficient would be the Right to Censor, right? If you look at Bull Buchanan, right? Let's say you have Bull Buchanan versus Scotty 2 Hotty in a random-ass Raw match, right? And let's say Bull Buchanan wins. And then afterwards, you have Val Venus being managed by Stevie Richards, and he beats Eddie Guerrero, right? Just by the way that Val Venus looks and Bull Buchanan looks, you will put together that they are part of the same unit. And then, that's how you get fans. Someone might like only Bull Buchanan, I don't know who that person would be, but they might like Bull Buchanan, they're like, oh, okay, cool. I like Bull, so now I like Val Venus too, right? I like the faction. But if you see Solo Sikoa wrestle, and then later on you see the Usos wrestle, nothing would indicate to you that they're the same faction, except for the fact that most of these guys wrestle with t-shirts on because they're fat bastards, right? And their t-shirt will just say, the bloodline. That's the problem. The factions don't have the things that are important anymore. Another thing that, in my personal opinion, is crucial to factions is a name, or a moniker at the very least, but a name that explains what they are without any confusion. So I'll give you a more modern example. The fucking, what's it called? The Hurt Business. The Hurt Syndicate now, but the Hurt Business, right? The Hurt Business, you don't need to be told anything about them. You understand exactly what they are, right? They are people who treat the dispensing of pain as a business, right? They're hired guns. They're here to beat you up, but they're in it for the money, right? So, for example, Bobby Lashley wanting to be WWE champion or Universal champion inherently makes sense. Why? Because Bobby Lashley understands that to be champion means to make more money, right? That's his motivation. Lashley, as a character, and when he won the title, he didn't start crying and celebrating. He was happy because this meant more money, right? This is a subtle character, but it is a character. But, for example, when the Iconics, right, which are just two like mean girls, when they win the tag team titles, they shouldn't be happy at all. Their attitude should be like, of course we won. We're better than everyone, right? Like the Beautiful People. They didn't start hugging each other and crying when they won the the knockout tag team titles, right? They didn't care. The presupposition was that they are better than everybody. They think so, at least. So of course they're not surprised that they became champions, right? They're gonna raise the title just to show, hey, I'm awesome. Versus Jey Uso raising the title to show, hey, Ma, I did it. Nobody cares about, hey, Ma, I did it. Maybe once in a while, but usually no, especially not in the context of factions. Going back to the main point of this subpoint, the name, right? When you have a name like the Bloodline, all you're telling me is that these guys are related. So what? I don't give a fuck if they're related or if they're friends. How does that change anything? The premise of a good name is that it tells me what the faction is about. So even something as stupid as Dark State, right? You could imply from that name, you could infer from that name that their goal is to cause chaos, right? They're there to just tear shit up, to ruin things for others, right? They want to turn NXT dark, right? To make it into a state of chaos. You see what I'm saying? That's what makes sense. Now let's look at some of the dumbass factions that we've had, especially with women's factions, right? Damage control. What the fuck does that mean? They control damage? What? What the fuck is that? What does that tell me about these three broads? I'll give you another example. Fatal attraction or fatal influence. There's toxic attraction and fatal influence, or toxic influence and fatal attraction. I don't know the difference, and I'm not sure which one's a real faction, which one isn't, right? Because the name speaks nothing. All the names are one bad thing, toxic, and a good thing, attraction or influence. Fatal, bad, influence, good. Toxic, bad, attraction, good. Damage, bad, control, good. This is not a good name. In other words, how the hell am I supposed to know the difference between toxic attraction and fatal influence? As a matter of fact, if tomorrow they come up with toxic influence and whatever, I'm getting lost in this, motherfuckers. If they come up with every permutation of those two words, the factions will be exactly the same. It's just three girls that want to win matches. You see what I'm saying? Another thing, and another very important thing, is that the factions' goals have to make sense and they have to be achievable through the context of the show that they are on, right? In this case, we're talking about wrestling, so they have to be achievable. For example, let's say we have a faction called Pissed Off Like Black Guys, right? Or Pissed Off White Guys, or Pissed Off Mexicans, right? Pissed Off Latinos. Latino World Order, but pissed off, right? This is a faction that I just invented in my head that their goals can be achieved. Let's say you have a faction, like for example, Pissed Off Latinos, the Latin American Exchange. Their argument, their reason for existing is to make the argument that Latinos in wrestling are being held down by the man, by the white man, presumably, right? They're being held down by the powers that be. So now they're taking matters into their own hands, and it makes sense that their goal is to become prominent by winning titles so that they can no longer be denied. And you can do the same thing with a faction of pissed off white guys, or a faction of pissed off Asians, or pissed off black guys, or even a faction of pissed off guys, right? Like the faction that Mick Foley was in with like Test. There was like there for like 2 weeks during the Attitude Era, right? They were basically like pissed off guys. Like they were like they're like, we're underrated. We want more opportunities. That's a much more interesting faction than fucking like, I don't know, The Vision. What's their goal? To win titles? Why are they called The Vision? Oh, they have a vision of what the future will look like. So does every other faction. That's baked into the concept. It would be like having a faction and calling them The Faction. Oh, we have that. It's called the Brotherhood, and in different wrestling promotions, and the Bloodline in WWE, right? What the fuck does that tell us? Nothing, motherfucks. So, the faction's goals have to be reachable one way or another. So, for example, the Wyatt family, and arguably the Wyatt Six, but definitely the Wyatt family, they had no goals. But even if you imply and you impugn the goals upon them, and your argument is, well, their goal is to like spread evil, like The Undertaker, who would literally come out and he'd say, I want to sacrifice Stephanie McMahon, make her my bride so I can take power in this company, right? If the Wyatt's family goal is to like spread evil, right, their alignment makes sense, right? They're attacking good guys. They want to kill the people that they perceive as bad guys, which are actually the good guys. But why are they doing this in wrestling, right? Why do they think that wrestling is the way to go, right? If they are a backwards cult, just be a backwards cult. And finally, another personal favorite of mine, factions that exist have to justify their existence within the wrestling world. What I mean by this is if your faction is, let's say, 10 racists, right? Let's say your faction is like 5 racists, right? 5 white supremacists, right? Well, that doesn't make sense in wrestling, right? Why would the WWE hire 5 white supremacists? Why would they do this? It doesn't make any sense, right? For example, the Nation of Domination made perfect sense because they were wrestlers that were already there with other horseshit gimmicks. And then they were like, oh, we're black and we're pissed off. That makes sense. You already have them in there, right? If you can form the faction like that, sure, right? Nobody should be fired just because they're black supremacists, right? Keep them there and have it make sense. But if you just hire a faction of, let's say, 3 backwards retard cultists like the Wyatt family, the question automatically should be, why were they hired? When they were interviewed, Bray Wyatt said, I'm here to stop Roman, man. I'm here to spread evil. I got the whole world. Like, immediately, John Laurinaitis or JR, whoever the fuck was hiring them, should have been like, okay, weird fuck, bounce, right? The faction and the existence of the faction has to make sense, right? It can start off silly. You can have a guy called The Undertaker who's just playing a character, and then he takes the character seriously and he becomes like a devil, right? Perfectly fine. And I'm going to be fair. I'm going to be honest. For example, hiring Kane, right, in terms of kayfabe, makes no sense. How did Kane get the job? He just showed up one day and he said, my brother burned me. And they're like, oh, perfect. Oh, do you have like an ID? My face is burned. And then they hired his ass and they sent him after The Undertaker. How does that make sense? But even when that happened, it was presented as an invasion. It was presented as like, yo, this guy's here. We can't stop him because look at him, right? Just like Retribution was presented as an invasion, or the Shield, largely, or Nexus was represented as an invasion, right? They're here. They didn't ask to be here. They just showed up, motherfuckers. And now you have to deal with them. So they get contracts through kayfabe reasons. That's the difference primarily, in my opinion, the things that I just said, between good factions and bad factions. Which brings us to the actual argument. WWE currently has no good factions. First of all, they have only a handful of factions, and they're basically loose alliances based upon similar personality traits, right? So you have like the no quarter catch crew, right? Like, what the fuck is that? It's just guys that wrestle the same way. You know? That's why it didn't work out. That's not compelling enough. So when people talk about factions and they say, well, this faction didn't work out, right? You have to ask yourself, in my opinion, you have to run yourself through the hater 6-factor analysis that I just laid out in front of you, right? Or was it 7? I don't know. I'm just shooting from the hip, cucks. So for example, I'll give you a great example. A lot of people, including the hater, enjoyed the Hurt business. The Hurt business. I always confuse them. I want to call them the Hurt Profits for some reason, right? But a lot of people enjoyed it. But once Lashley became champion, right? And once they had the tag team titles as well, once they were on top, there's no point for the faction to exist anymore. I guess it's just to keep their dominance. But Lashley did it. He became champion. Why does he need a faction anymore, right? His goal was to become champion and get power for himself and make more money. Now he's doing that, right? I'm not saying the breakup was a wise decision. In my opinion, it was a terrible decision. But it wasn't this ridiculous decision. It would be like, imagine if The Undertaker becomes like the CEO of WWE as the dead man, right? Well, why does he need Mideon anymore? Now he's in charge. Why do I need the faction to back me up? I am the boss, right? See what I'm getting at here? The faction's goals either cannot be reached, they have to be reachable but never reached, or they have to be loosely reached, or the ideal situation is that they have to be goals that they will never reach, but they can always strive towards reaching. Like for example, DX. Their goal is to make a mockery of WWE, right? Their goal is to be lewd degenerates. Their goal is to be funny and to be provocative. They get off on people being uncomfortable, right? That's their goal. That's a goal that you'll never reach because there are degenerates in the world that will like this, right? So you'll never get everybody on board. You'll never get anybody to hate you. And there are people like, you know, the Frasier types and Niles types from Frasier, right? That will never get on board. So you have to keep pushing the envelope and, you know, making more dick jokes, right? Because your goal of turning everything degenerate can never be reached, right? But the goal of evil defeating good or good defeating evil can easily be reached, right? The best example of this would be the WWE locker room during the Alliance, right? The Alliance, for better or worse, was a faction, right? The WWE locker room at that point became a massive counter faction, right? You had the two groups and they had an end goal. Suppress the other faction and win and get dominance, right? And give the company back to Vince, the company that they love, right? Meanwhile, the other guys, their goal was to put Vince out of business and put the company in the hands of Shane and Stephanie and Paul Heyman. See what I'm saying? That was the goal. That had to come to a head. And it did at Survivor Series. It wouldn't make sense if after Survivor Series, the Alliance continued being a faction, right? They lost. They don't have any power. They can't anymore fulfill their goals, right? But for example, another faction war that is not considered a faction war because it's very loose, to be fair, was during the height of the brand split, the Raw versus SmackDown quasi-faction war, right? That can go on forever because the shows are not going to stop. So the two factions, the two rivals can go on forever, similar to a sports team, right? The fucking Eagles and the Cowboys, or the Commanders and the Cowboys and the Giants as well, let's throw them in there, right? They have a rivalry because every year they have to fuck with each other, right? So every year is a new opportunity to continue the rivalry. It's a rivalry that's built to never end. See what I'm getting at here? That's how it works, right? In this day and age, factions largely have no reason for existing, right? The Calling in NXT. What the fuck is the Calling? They just thought they found a cool name. They're like, yeah, we're just a bunch of badasses. Great. So is Dark State, right? A lot of factions have no reason to be. And that's the bottom line, motherfucks. The fact is, the faction is, motherfucks, look at that pun, right? The fact is what the fact is. And that is that in order to have successive factions that go one after the other, right? Where one faction becomes another form of that faction, like Bullet Club or something like that, right? There are only two ways to do it. Come up with a faction that's awesome, or have a faction that's just like Bullet Club. A loose alliance with absolutely no goals, but to have more championships. Like if you are, let's say you are like Cedric Alexander, right? In the Hurt Business, right? It makes sense if Lashley's the champion because you're part of the profit share, right? You're associated with a champion Therefore, you're going to be booked in more matches. You're going to make more money. People might buy more merchandise of yours, right? But if you are Eric Rowan, right, and Bray Wyatt's goal is to like cause evil, why do you give a shit, right? Unless it's your goal too. But then the question becomes, why is it your goal, right? None of the things that were answered by the Wyatt family, right? Versus, for example, when you have two guys called the Acolytes and a third guy called Midian, right? The implications are, these are Undertaker's puppets. They do as he's told. They are servants. They are his slaves, his mental slaves, basically, right? They're his acolytes. That explains itself. But other situations do not explain themselves. And that's why some factions are better than others. And that's also why today's factions are complete garbage. With that being said, the hater has spoken, motherfuckers, because that's how I roll.